We continue through the Gospel of Mark, looking at Jesus' ministry according to him, and we stay with chapter 6. Last week we looked at Jesus feeding the 5,000, and now the moments immediately after that, as Jesus puts the disciples to a test of their faith. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognized him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities, or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. This is the word of the Lord. And how important that new life is as we look today at the life of the disciples, as we look at the trials and the tribulations they went through as they came to know Jesus. And our text for today is going to come from Mark, as stated, Mark chapter 6. We look at Jesus walking on the water, but please hear again these words from that text. But when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be ever pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Amen. For our message today, we are going to be walking through the text, through all of the passages in order. And so we're going to pick out some of the important aspects of those passages, and you're going to notice that some of the verses are actually highlighted in yellow. We're going to be looking and emphasizing those specifically. So let's look at 45 through 48. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. Few noteworthy things. Notice how Jesus sends them out into the lake by themselves. Now, this is the first time Jesus actually sends his disciples on the water without him being there. As we've already gone through the Gospel of Mark, the first time they're in the boat with Jesus, they're in a storm, Jesus is sleeping, Jesus calms it. Second time was actually on their way to this desolate place where he fed the 5,000 plus people, which we talked about last week. He was in the boat. This time he's not. And even more peculiar, there is a strong headwind toward Bethsaida when you cross the water. Jesus knows this, and once again, he puts him in a boat in a challenging situation. Now, I don't know, if I were a disciple, I might sit there and say, "Wait a second, Jesus, I don't know if I ever want to get in a boat with you again. Because every time you put me in a boat, I feel like I'm about to lose my life." Every time. It was no different this time. But then you'll notice, if you look at what's happening here, Jesus went to go pray. It was evening. So we know that the feeding of the 5,000, it said that it was evening before they wound up feeding everybody. Well, evening came again. So it makes me wonder, how long was Jesus up there praying alone? Maybe a good day? At least half a day? That's a long, long time. And it also makes me wonder then, how long were the disciples straining against those headwinds? How long were they futilely trying to paddle, or probably using oars at this point, trying to make it through the water? Noteworthy. We'll get back to that going ahead. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they all thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. You know, it's interesting. When you look at these disciples, remember, some of them are fishermen. This isn't their first time out on sea, probably not their first time against a headwind. So in that boat, in that boat you had disciples, but they should have had everything that they needed. First off, they had a boat. They had sails, and there is a way to sail through headwind, though it's probably the most challenging way to sail. They probably had oars, in case for whatever reason the sails didn't work or there wasn't any wind to move them. And then on top of that, because they were all fishermen, they had the know-how and how to do all these things. But even though they had everything the world says they needed, they still couldn't do it. And yet it was Jesus who put them in this situation. Go figure. You know, I can't say I've ever been in a headwind out on a boat. I've been in a headwind in an airplane, and all it does is it slows your flight down maybe up to an hour. I don't know. It's kind of inconvenient. But I've never gotten stopped by a headwind. But when I think of headwind here, I'm not thinking of in terms of sailing. I think the headwinds we face are sometimes the things Jesus calls us to do, but they feel otherwise impossible to complete. Jesus tells us, for example, to love our neighbors. Well, let me tell you, there are certain people in my life I'm not always comfortable around. There are people who are not very nice to me, people who mistreat me, people who don't give me basic dignity or respect. And God wants me to love them. How do you do that? How do you love the people who give you the most grief? God calls us to forgive 70 times 7. In other words, we forgive nonstop. And yet, is it that easy to forgive someone who's hurt you, who's broken your heart, who might do it again, who you expect is going to do it again? And yet I have to forgive them. Sometimes we are given impossible headwinds. Maybe it's another thing. Many of us are parents, and for those of us who have parents whose kids are older, you had young kids once, and you know that sometimes parenting can be a very exhausting feat. It can really take a lot out of you, and you wonder where you get the energy to do all these things. And yet Jesus tells you to love your kids and to love your family and to constantly put them first. And then maybe there's a time that we failed, a time where we strived at something and we fell hard, and we no longer have that confidence to get back up and try it again. Or maybe the real headwind is something different. Maybe it's a habit, a sinful habit that we battle, and every time we try and fight it and not do it again, we keep falling back into it for whatever reason. These are the types of headwinds we're talking about. These are the things where Jesus calls us to do one thing, and yet when we face them, it feels impossible. Notice, though, how the disciples, as they were doing this, they were using worldly means to fight the headwinds. They were probably using their know-how. They were probably using the oars because, the sails weren't working too well. They probably tried the sails, by the way. They tried their boat. They literally tried everything. And they've been at this for a good day. That's a long time to keep straining and feel like you're getting nowhere. Why didn't they just give up earlier? So the question then we need to ask ourselves is, how do we navigate through headwinds? How do we navigate through those challenges in life that God calls us to be faithful, and yet it feels impossible to get through those? Well, we go back to our text and look at that highlighted, I look just before that highlighted point. It says, and Jesus walked by walking on the water, and he meant to pass by them. Notice how Jesus had no trouble with those headwinds. He had no trouble with the water. And on top of that, he walked right by the boat very intentionally, but he made it look as though he was going to ignore them. You see, Jesus was hoping, this was a test of faith. Jesus was hoping that in all that straining and all of that failure and all of those things, they would finally just cry out for the Lord. And Jesus was hoping, since they could see that he had no problem doing this, they would cry out to him. But they did the opposite. First, they didn't recognize it was Jesus. They thought it was a ghost. So they cried out in terror and were probably in despair. They felt they were in a hopeless situation. And I think sometimes when we face those headwinds, it's hard to see God in the middle of it. It is hard to see God in the picture of it. And maybe if God is there, we don't recognize him as he is. And you sit there and think, God, I'm trying to be faithful to you, and yet you're not showing up. You're not, and maybe we're praying a certain thing, God, you're not delivering in the way I expect you to. And it's just we don't recognize what God is doing. And it feels so futile. And so the temptation is just that. We give up. And when we don't recognize God, we feel, when we think about loving our neighbors, well, we just instead do the opposite. We just ignore them. Or we just put them aside. Or maybe we're nasty back. Maybe if they're family members, they still come over for Thanksgiving, but we ignore certain subjects. We pretend like there isn't a problem. We act as though everything's fine, just to keep that very unstable peace. There's all these reasons. And maybe we think about those people that have hurt us. Well, the world says to stay angry at them, to push them out. Or maybe go find some people who agree with you to rally around you and give you some support. Because at least then, you have people who make you feel better and you don't have to deal with that person. Well, if we don't recognize Jesus and we think about maybe being a parent, or just some of the other things, not even being a parent, just our jobs or other things that exhaust us that we have to do, maybe we just give up, or we start to slack, or we start to just push some of those responsibilities onto someone else because we don't want to keep facing them. And then, of course, there's that feeling of failure that nobody likes. And given that we failed once, whatever it is, we no longer have the confidence to try again. For those of us with those sinful bad habits, those ones we keep trying to kick, those ones we know we shouldn't be doing, but we keep falling back into, well, what's the point if we can't see Jesus there? What's the point? The disciples cry out to Jesus. Well, they don't cry out to Jesus. They cry at Jesus because they don't recognize him. But let me tell you how God responds to that. Because God could have just, we're talking about Jesus here, Jesus could have just walked on. He didn't need to help them. He had no good reason to help them because truly they didn't understand, they didn't recognize him. They weren't being faithful. They were sinful people. Jesus didn't have to help them. But that's not who Jesus is. Let's look at the next part. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." And when he got into the boat with them, and he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Jesus had no reason to help these guys, but he did anyway, because he loved them. He loved them, and he knew that they were going to be destined for great things, for bringing his church to the world. Jesus looked at the bigger picture of who these people were and said, I'm not going to let them go. So even though they failed their test miserably, Jesus went over to them anyway. He made himself known, and he told them to take heart. And if you look at the Greek translation there, take heart is one way to say it. I like to say have courage. And here's the thing about having courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. You may have heard this before. It's not the absence of fear. Courage is still striving, even though you're afraid. It's still going ahead, even if you're uncertain of the outcome. That's courage. Jesus said, have courage in this headwind. Have courage, because I'm here. And then it says Jesus got into the boat. And only after did he reveal himself, and only after did he get into the boat that the wind stopped. the headwinds went away. Just like the last two times they were in the boat, the same principle applied here. Jesus needed to be in the boat to face those headwinds. And the same is true for us. No matter what we are battling, no matter what we are struggling with, no matter what task just feels utterly impossible that we keep failing at, Jesus is still in the boat. So this room that we're in right now, in a very traditional church building, the place where all the pews are, or the chairs, it's called a nave. That's the official term, N-A-V-E. And a nave is actually a nautical term. It's a boat term because a church is described as a ship. And that's the bigger space. That's where all the people are in the boat. And the reality is, you and I are in the boat too, because we are part of God's family. And the thing is, when we leave here today, we're not getting out of the boat. We're taking the boat with us because we are still part of God's family. And guess who's in the boat with us? Even when we leave here. Jesus is in the boat. So how do you battle headwinds? Number one, you believe Jesus is there. You believe that he is not only there, but he is capable of delivering you through the very commands that he has given you to do. God is not going to give you something impossible that he can't do through you. But then there's a second thing we need to do. You notice I'm actually doubling back to the beginning of our text here, but I want to laser focus on verse 46. It says, and after he had taken leave of the disciples, Jesus went on the mountain to pray. Notice what Jesus did before he went into the same headwinds that the disciples were in. He prayed. I remember a devotion that we got from our senior pastor at my previous church. He sends out devotions sometimes, and he had one on this very text. And he said, did you notice that Jesus made far more progress than the disciples ever did? And he did something entirely different. He prayed. Before he took on that task, he was with his Father. So how do you tackle headwinds? Number one, you believe Jesus is with you, but number two, you pray. You pray, believing that God knows what he's doing, that God is capable of all things. And even that, maybe if you see those headwinds coming, you pray preemptively, like Jesus did, fully believing that he hears you and he is going to take care of you no matter the outcome. So, we're left with a question. How are we facing the headwinds in our lives? Are we trying to do it through worldly means? Are we trying to solve the problem by taking more rest, by ignoring certain people, maybe by spending a little more money toward whatever this is, hoping that these gifts, or maybe our knowledge, we're trying to use our knowledge to solve these problems, and yet we keep coming up short. We're still not truly satisfied no matter how hard we try. Are we striving through these headwinds through worldly means? Or are we turning to the guy who's in the boat with us already? I imagine that even though these headwinds in your life are probably not going to change, you're going to encounter them again. I imagine, though, that when you face them again, if you turn to Christ, the outcome will be different. It doesn't mean that they may go away, but it means where you're going to be spiritually, where you are going to be, and that relationship is going to grow. And you're going to find that real peace doesn't come through those worldly means, it comes through Christ. Real joy doesn't come through having the perfect relationships with people, it comes through that perfect relationship with Christ. Because here you find that Jesus himself, when he prayed, he hasn't stopped. You know that even to this day, Jesus is still praying for us. He is still in heaven at the right hand of his Father praying for you. Praying that you face those headwinds with courage, with faith. And he wants to hear from you. Because you know that you can trust him with these things. And you know that because Jesus did the impossible for us. Not only walking on water, he gave his life for us. He did the actual one impossible thing that we cannot do. So that you and I can have that relationship with him. So are we striving after worldly means for those headwinds? Or are we striving after Christ? I pray the latter for all of you, because I know the outcome, that he is faithful, no matter what. Amen.